Mhm. Okay. It's always one of the highlights of the trip to Eretz Yisrael is being with you at the Mishmar. You always walk away very inspired. And Bezras Hashem, if somehow that together we can elevate the level of learning and Hasmad and the Koach HaTfilah, it makes my entire trip more and more than worthwhile. We just began celebrating Rosh Chodesh. The Gemara in Sukkah Daf Memvav quotes the pasuk of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, and the Gemara raises the obvious question: V'chi b'yom mevarchenosa, v'layla ein mevarchenosa. Is bracha only bayom, and bracha is not balayla, but rather b'chol yom v'yom teino me'in berchosav shel yom. When a person davens, you have to mention the special character of the day. Rashi writes that means that shel Shabbos b'Shabbos, shel Yontif b'Yontif. The girsa we have in Rashi is shel chol b'chol, but the Rashash writes the real proper girsa in Rashi should be Rosh Chodesh, and that's Mefurish in Meiri. That part of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom means that you have to acknowledge that indeed today is a day of Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, in benching, in tefillah, we have to insert the main hama'ora of Yala V'Yava. Tosfos raises a very fundamental issue, Brachas Daf Chavav Mebeis. To what extent do we assume that Yala V'Yava is considered to be an inherent part of the tefillah? On the one hand, of course, there's a Chiyuv Askara. But imagine if a person were to go ahead and daven and you fail to recite Yala V'Yava. You're obligated when it comes to Shachris Mincha to repeat the Shmon Esrei. Why exactly is that true? One could envision in one of two ways. That one is very simply, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom means you have a Chiyuv Askara. And if you miss the opportunity to mention Yala V'Yava, that has to be made up. You can't recite Yala V'Yava in a vacuum, and therefore you have to daven again. Maybe one could argue something even beyond that, and that is that Baruch Hashem Yom Yom is not an independent Chiyuv Askara, but rather it's part of Cheftzah Shel Tefillah. It's an inherent part of the Shmon Esrei itself. And if a person is missing a brach of Shmon Esrei, you have to repeat very simply because you weren't Yotzei your Chiyuv of Tefillah. And that's a fascinating diyun, a Chakira, Reb Chaim, and others, that to what extent do we assume that Baruch Hashem Yom Yom really is considered to be an inherent part of the Shmon Esrei itself? Tosfos raises the following issue. Let's assume, for example, tomorrow at Mincha, a person forgets to recite Yala V'Yava, and he doesn't recognize the fact that he forgot to do so until already the next night. What exactly do you do? At that point in time, even if you daven again, you're not going to be able to make up the Yala V'Yava that you missed. It's no longer Rosh Chodesh. If indeed you're Yotzei Tefillah, you're missing a Chiyuv Askara, so Kolman, that you can make up the Chiyuv Askara, of course you should do so. But if you're going to argue you weren't Yotzei Tefillah, a person is obligated to daven again. And those are the two days that Tosfos discusses. Tosfos writes the following Chiddush, that in such a case there's no need to daven again because Lo Yarviach Klum. You're not going to gain anything with your second Shmon Esrei. After all, Shmon Esrei, apparently you're Yotzei. You're missing the Chiyuv Askara. You're not going to be making up the missing Chiyuv Askara Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. Why would you daven again? And the Rosh in that daf quotes the Chachmei Provence that disagrees and argues that no, you're obligated to daven again because after all, Pashup Shat, you weren't Yotzei the Chiyuv of Tefillah. And therefore, good, you're not going to make up the Yala V'Yava that you missed, but nonetheless, a person is obligated to go ahead and to daven. Two very fascinating deals machlokas between Tosfos and the Rosh. The Mechaber Paskins and Siman Kufches, in such a case that yes, a person should daven again, but he should have in mind a daita d'nedava, that maybe indeed there's no chiyuv to repeat. He's only doing so as a tfilas nedava, and therefore that should be his mindset. Mishnah Berurah writes there, Kufches, Ivkatan, Lamed Vav, that if that's the case, so what about this Rosh Chodesh? This Rosh Chodesh, after all that a person forgets at Mincha, you mend the night afterwards, it's Shabbos, That the Rambam writes in the name of the Gaonim, there is no tfilas nedava on Shabbos. So therefore, Mishnah Berurah paskins that enochinami, in such an instance that you would not have it again. Mikra din, we're going to assume like the sheet of Tosfos, lo yavi aklum, The Chumrah would be chayish for the Rosh as a tfilas nadava. If you can't daven a tfilas nadava, then one would not do so. And why does Tosas discuss this in Brachos and Daf Chavav? Because there the Gemara has what Tosas writes is a similar case. Imagine, for example, a person doesn't daven mincha on Shabbos. So you know what? He's obligated to go ahead and daven a double Shmon Esrei on Motzei Shabbos. So let's assume a person does the following. He knows he has to daven a double Shmon Esrei. The question simply is as follows: when do I recite Atah Chanantanu? After all, maybe the person suggests the following. You know what? The first, let me take care of my chiyuv of mincha, and then I'll go ahead and I'll daven Mariv. If that really is true, so in his first Shmon Esrei, he didn't recite Atah Chanantanu. His second Shmon Esrei that he thought was Mariv, he did recite Atah Chanantanu. In that instance, no, really that's inappropriate, because after all, the Rif says that the Seder is considered to be li'ikuva, because after all, a tfilas tashlumin has to follow a tfilas chova. So in such an instance, that is li'ikuva, and a person is obligated to daven again, a third Shmon Esrei. That's the Chiddush of the Rif. That third Shmon Esrei, would you say Atah Chanantanu? Obviously not. You said Atah Chanantanu in the second Shmon Esrei. So you're going to daven a third Shmon Esrei without Atah Chanantanu to make up for the first Shmon Esrei, which was a Shmon Esrei without Atah Chanantanu. Oh, so Tosas writes, if that really is true, you're going to daven the very same words. Normally, when a person makes up that which he missed, on such a case, you're adding something in the second tefillah that you failed to recite in the first. In this case, that what do you mean that tefillah 1 and tefillah 3 are identical? Oh, apparently Tosas says that you don't argue lo yarviach klum, that you have to add something in the Shmon Esrei. And fascinating, Tosas says what is true about Atah Chanantanu really is true when it comes to Yalav Yavo as well. That person that made that mistake, again, he davened Shachris Musaf on Shabbos, but he forgot to daven Mincha, and all of a sudden he realizes his mistake, it's not Motzei Shabbos, and therefore he figures, look, the first tefillah is Tashlumei Mincha, the second tefillah is Mariv, and therefore I'm not going to say Atah Chanantanu in the first Shmon Esrei. You know, one could suggest that also is a mistake. Not only the mistake that Tosas writes b'Shem Harif, that you flip the order, that you daven first a tefillas tashlumin before a tefillas chova. Let's assume that would be okay. That would be okay. Let me ask you the following question. Why is it that in Mariv Motzei Shabbos, you recite Atah Chanantanu? Why exactly is that true? Is that really inherently midin Mariv? Is that so obviously part of Mariv? Let me ask you the following case. You have a person who didn't daven Mariv on Motzei Shabbos at all. And let's assume, for simplicity, the person did not even make Havdalah. All of a sudden, he wakes up Sunday morning, and he realizes he has to daven 2 Shmon Esreis. I have to go ahead and daven Shachris and Tashlumei Mariv. The person knows the halacha. First Shachris, the Tfilas Chova, and then the Tfilas Tashlumei. When would you recite Atah Chanantanu? When would you recite Atah Chanantanu? So, Mishnah Berurah writes, well, obviously, in the second Shmon Esrei. After all, the first Shmon Esrei is Shachris. Shachris does not have Atah Chanantanu, but the second Shmon Esrei is a makeup for Mincha, makeup for Mariv, whatever the case is. In such an instance, then you recite Atah Chanantanu. That's the Psaka Mishnah Berurah. Reb Chaim disagreed. Reb Chaim assumed the following, that why is it that Atah Chanantanu is in Mariv? It's Midine Mariv, and Midine Mariv, you know what I'll tell you? You know, Tosas already points out that one is not allowed to daven a tfilas chol b'Shabbos. And therefore, before a person davens a tfilas chol, you have to be mavdil ben kodesh l'chol. You know, the positioning is incredible. Now, a person davens the first 3 brachos of Shmon Esrei. You know, that's not a tfilas chol. That's shevach. That's not bakasha. A person recites the words atachon in lam das. That really is not about kasha either. That is considered to be praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu, atachonen. What's the first bakasha that you have in Shmon Esrei? Chanenu mitcha. So right after atachonen, right before chanenu mitcha, you have to be mavdol beKadosh l'chol. That's the placement of Atah Chanantanu. Maybe Atah Chanantanu me'ikar hadin is in the first tfilas chol. Lav dafkan tfilas mariv. You're true. 99.99% of the time, the first tfilas chol is mariv. Let's assume, for example, a wouldn't daven mariv, and his first tfilas chol is shachris. Reb Chaim assumed lahalacha that clearly a person should recite a Tachanantanu in the first Shemona Esrei. That would mean even if a person made that mistake and he thought that first take care of Mincha and then Daven Marev, he still should have recited a Tachanantanu in the first Shemona Esrei, because that was considered to be the first Shemona Esrei, which indeed is a tfilas chol. There is a machlokas, Reb Chaim and Reb Tzipei Sachrank. Reb Chaim, in the old editions, Reb Chaim al-Ashas was found in Siman Aleph. The Tzipei Sachrank or Reb Chaim Siman Nun Dalid. What about the following case? A person davens Mincha and Erev Shabbos, and he makes a mistake regarding the Saint Talamata. That's liikuva. That really is liikuva. And all of a sudden he realizes his problem, but you know what? Tonight is Shabbos. I'm going to daven another Shemona Esrei to make up for what I missed, but I'm not going to say the Saint Talamata. I'm going to daven a Tefillah Shabbos. Reb Chaim suggested the following chiddush, that the Saint Talamata is likuva, because that's part of the Chefetz Shel Bracha. And therefore, you would be obligated to daven another Shemona Esrei, even if that Shemona Esrei was a Shabbos Shemona Esrei, it wasn't a Chol Shemona Esrei. Tzvi disagreed because very, very simply, a person forgets to say the Saint Talamata. You know what? All is not lost. You can make it up in Shema Kaleinu. I'm here from Chutz La'aretz for a limited amount of time, so therefore, in Shemona Esrei, I recited the same bracha, and I recited the same Talamata in the bracha of Shema Kaleinu, and therefore you'll say L'chol Hadeos. You have a right to go in and to make up a same Talamata in Shema Kaleinu. What exactly does it mean? You can make it up in Shema Kaleinu. Doesn't that indicate that it's not part of the Chefetz Shel Bracha Birchas Hashanim, but rather it's a Chovas Hazkara? And if it's a Chovas Hazkara, one can make it up even later in the Shemona Esrei. If indeed it's considered to be a Chovas Hazkara, so in such a case, only repeat the Shemona Esrei if you're going to make up that Hazkara. Otherwise, one would not be obligated to do so. But no doubt, that's a fascinating model. Davening an additional Shemona Esrei, where you're going to recite the exact same words as you did in error. You're not going to be able to make up that which you missed, but do you argue really that you weren't Yotze? You weren't Yotze, the Shemona Esrei at all. Imagine a person, Psachim Kuvches, now he's sitting at the Leil Seder, and he ate matzah without his seba. So what exactly do you do? So the person knew the lumdis, he learned the brisker of, no, machlokes the Rosh, and Tosus, the Rambam. No, whether his seba is likuva, it's not likuva. Tosus suggests that you're not yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. If you eat matzah without heseba, that's the psak of the Rosh. And the Rambam writes that heseba is not midine matzah, but heseba is part of sipur yetzias Mitzrayim, chayev adam leharos esatzmo. You demonstrate your cheres by doing heseba. And therefore the Rambam shita is that heseba is part of sipur yetzias Mitzrayim. And therefore, the Rambam has a chumra and a kula. The kula of the Rambam is if you eat matzah without heseba, you're yotzei. The chumra of the Rambam is why is heseba limited to matzah? If it's part of sipur yetzias Mitzrayim, one should engage in heseba for all achil and shtia, and that is the psak of the Rambam, that the mitzvah muvchar is to do heseba throughout the entire achila. There is a Meiri, Psach Mekuvches, that writes that you should do heseba during Magid. Wow, during Hallel. After all, if you have to do heseba for the kos of Magid and the kos of Hallel, so certainly you have to do heseba for the entirety of the Magid and Hallel. Hayu misubim b'mnei brak. No, the Meiri, heseba, that was necessary at that time. So imagine, a person eats matzah to Seder without heseba. Okay, he knows all the shiurim, but he doesn't know the bottom line. So do I have to repeat? Do I not have to repeat? He's very fortunate though. He lives next door to his Rebbe. He goes next door to his Rebbe. He asks his Rebbe, do I have to repeat? His Rebbe tells him that yes, we're chayish for the rush. You have to go and eat another kazayis matzah beheseba, but ifnei Rabbo, you're not chayiv to do heseba. Okay, so he has to eat another kazayis matzah b'li heseba because he ate a kazayis matzah b'li heseba. But you'll tell me, no, the first kazayis, he was at home. The second kazayis is indeed b'fnei Rabbo. Is it so obvious he'd be choser, not choser? No, as a mashal. No, Tosus is yesod of lo yarviach klum. The following chiddush, the Gemara tells us when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, it's true that in Shachris and Mincha, you have to be choser, not when it comes to marriage. If a person, for example, tonight forgot to say Yalav Yavo, in such a case, one is not choser. One is not choser. Okay. Why exactly is that true? Why is that true? The Gemara writes, because the Azkar of Yalav Yavo was penned after Kiddush HaChodesh. And Kiddush HaChodesh is only Bayom. Kiddush HaChodesh is not Balayla. So the main Chiyuv Azkar of Yalav Yavo is Bayom. It is not Balayla. And therefore, in such a case, you're not Choser. So Tosfos writes the following, Brachos Tav Chavav Hamad Aleph, that why do you need that reason? Kiddush HaChodesh. Isn't Tefillah Sarvis a Rishus? And if Tefillah Sarvis is a Rishus, why would you have to be Choser? Why would you have to be Choser? I understand Shachris Mincha, yes, wow, that's considered to be a Tefillah Schova. But if Tefillah Sarvis is considered to be a Rishus, why would you have to be Choser in such an instance? So Tosfos writes, realize Rishus does not mean optional. Does not mean optional. The Rambam quotes the Gaonim, Shavula Kachova, that we already have taken upon ourselves to daven Mariv and to treat it to an extent as a tefillah schova. There is a chiddush of Berhetiv, Siman Kuvches. Berhetiv writes the following. You know why you need that reason in the Gemara, that Kiddush HaChodesh is only B'yom, and Kiddush HaChodesh is not Balayla? You know why you need that? For our case, let's assume, for example, a person didn't have mincha. He didn't have a mincha. He's chayiv in tashlumin. I'll ask you like a fascinating question. What's the status of tashlumei mincha? What's the status of tashlumei mincha? On the one hand, mincha is a tefillas chova. And if I miss that, I have to make up tefillas mincha. That would seemingly indicate that tashlum mincha is a chova. But mariv is only rishos. And that Gemara that I mentioned, Brachos and Daf Chavav, tells us that, that the tefillas tashlumin is an expansion of the ikar tefillah bizmana. So tashlumei mincha, on the one hand, is an expansion of mariv. That's why the order is mariv and then tashlumei mincha. On the other hand, you're making up mincha, which is a tefillas chova. So what exactly is the status? The status of tashlumei mincha. Is that a chova, or is that only considered to be rishus? That's unclear. There is a Rashash, the Rashash in Brachas Chavav, that writes that, Mariv is a rishus and Tashlumei Mincha is a rishus. The Berhetiv Kuvches disagrees and writes that that's not true, that Mariv is rishus, but Tashlumei Mincha is a status of Mincha. That's considered to be a chova. So the Berhetiv writes the following. Let's assume the reason if you forget Yalav Yavo would only be because Tefillah Sarvis is a rishus. So what would happen then in the following case? A person, let's say, didn't have a mincha. He realizes his mistake, and therefore he goes ahead and davens tashlumei mincha, and he forgets Yalav Yavo. Tashlumei mincha is a chova, the Berhetiv writes, kuvches. If the reason you wouldn't be choser at night for Yalav Yavo is because Tefillah Sarvis is a rishus, you'd have to be choser. But if the reason is because of Brachas Chavtes, that Kiddush HaChodesh is only Bayom, and Kiddush HaChodesh is not at all Balayla, wow. So in such a case, that would apply even when it comes to Tashlumei Mincha as well. Wow, that's the Chiddush of Berhetiv, Kuvches, Uvizeh Yituras Kushus Atosus. No? That why the Gemara needed the reason of Kiddush HaChodesh as opposed to the case of Tefillas Arvis. I'll tell you the following possible nafkamina. There is a Gemara in Shabbos Chaf Daled, where the Gemara discusses the following. As you know, tomorrow night, unusual, there's a Chazaras Hashatz for Mariv. No? The bracha main sheva, a bracha main sheva. You daven your Shemona Esrei, and then the Chazan goes ahead and repeats. That's quite unusual. Why exactly is that true? Clear from the Gemara that was a separate takana. And that was as follows, that realized people were coming late to shul. And what happens when you come to late to shul? Bisman Hazeh, the minig is the last one's in or the first one's out, but that wasn't true in the time of the Gemara. Now, you came late, you were the last to leave. You were the last to leave because you had to daven. You know what that meant? That people were leaving the shul late at night by themselves because, that was a sakana. And pretty incredible, Chazal instituted a special Chazaras Hashatz in order to see to it that would not happen. Everyone would leave together. How is that a solution? That's Machlokas Rashi and the Gon. Now Rashi in that Sugya Shabbos Chavdalid and the Gon in Simon Reish Samaches. Rashi writes the following. You know what the Chazal did? They bought time. They bought time. They made the tefillah a little bit longer, a little bit longer. And that would give the person enough time to be able to catch up. They came a little bit late. They were a little bit behind. So you know what? We'll have a Chazar Sashatz. Davening will be a little bit longer, and then everybody can go ahead and leave together. You know, according to Rashi Shita, one could argue as follows, that Chazal instituted a Shmon Esrei, a form of a Chazar Sashatz. They didn't have to. They could have instituted Tilim. They could have instituted announcements. They could have done something to make the davening a little bit longer, and everybody would leave together. Chazal instituted a Shmon Esrei. You know what the Gon writes in Reish Samaches? Something incredible. No. It's not that the latecomer would just have extra time to daven a Shmon Esrei, but you're ready. Instead of davening a Shmon Esrei, the latecomer would be Yotzei with the bracha Achas Vein Sheva. Wow. That was the takana. Instead of davening individually, because I'm running late, I'll be Yotzei with bracha Achas Vein Sheva. That's Chiddush that the Gon writes. They couldn't have instituted Tilim or announcements. No, they needed a Me'ein HaTfilah in order to be Yotzei, because the latecomer would be Yotzei with the bracha Achas Vein Sheva, be Yotzei with Magen Avos. That's what the Torah writes in Reish Samaches, that under certain conditions, if necessary, a person can be Yotzei, is Chiv Shmon Esrei, with Magen Avos. I would ask you the following: how obvious is that? That you can be Yotzei your Chiyuv with Magen Avos? I'll tell you very simply as follows. According to Rashi, it's possible, but it's not Muchach, it's a Chiddush. According to the Gon, well, obviously that's true. The whole reason it was instituted was in order for you to be Yotzei. So the fact that at times you can be Yotzei with Magen Avos, according to the Gon, that's self-evident. That indeed was the takana. And that's the Minhag HaGra, that the Tzibur doesn't say Magen Avos. Only the Chazan says Magen Avos, because that was really a form of a Chazar Sashatz. So I'll ask you the following question, very simple. Is that so obvious that if I fail to daven an entire Shmon Esrei of 7 brachos, I can make it up with 1 bracha? Why is that so obvious? That indeed I could do so. If the halach is you have to daven a full Shmon Esrei, why is it so obvious that I can make that up with an abridged Shmon Esrei? Why exactly is that true? I'll give you an example. The person has to recite Birchas Hamazon. Birchas Hamazon is 3 brachas. Let's say a person recites an Alamichya instead. Are Yotzei benching with an Alamichya? You know why that's so important? In an unusual case where instead of benching, a person recites an Alamichya, I understand, but I'll tell you why it's so important. Because there's so many cases, Pasaba Bekisnin, where it's a suffix, whether something is Hamotzi, or whether it's Mazonos, whether it's an Alamichya, or whether it's Birchas Hamazon. A suffix Birchas Hamazon, a suffix Alamichya. The Din Rabbi Kiveger. Is that a suffix Daraisa, or is that a suffix Drabana? Sveika Daraisa is L'chumra. A suffix Dran is L'kula. Is that a suffix Daraisa, or is that a suffix Drabanan? If I could be Yotzei mi Daraisa, Birchas Hamazon with an Alamichya, you know what that does? That reduces all the Sveikos of Pasaba Bekisnin to a suffix Drabanan, because maybe I be Yotzei. After all, what is it that you're missing if you say an Alamichya? Number one is the Minyan HaBrachas. Is the Minyan HaBrachas Daraisa Drabanan? Rov Rishonim Isum Drabanan. There is a Tosas Brachas Tezayin that sounds like it's Daraisa, but Rov Rishonim Adin Drabanan. Oh, maybe you'll tell me the following. Benching has bris and Torah. Gemara Brachos and Daf Memches. And Alamichya doesn't have bris and Torah. Is bris and Torah Daraisa, or is bris and Torah Drabanan? That's Machlokas Tosas and a Ritva. The Tosas is Brachos Tav Chaf Mebeis. The Ritva has a separate chibur which is called Hilchos Brachos, where Mefurish in Ritva that bris and Torah is only a din derabanan. But it's not at all obvious if I have to daven 7 brachos, that I can make it up with 1. Why is that true? Ooh, you know what the Torah writes, Reish Samaches? That's only because Tefillah Sarvis is Rishus. If Tefillah Sarvis would have been a Tefillah Schova, you could not make up a 7 bracha Shmon Esrei with 1 bracha. But if Tefillah Sarvis is only Rishus, oh, so in such a case, then yes, you can make it up with a single bracha. That's a pretty stunning chiddush to the Torah, Reish Samaches. The reason you can make up A 7 brachas Shemona Esrei with one. The reason I can be Yotzei with Magen Avos is K'tilas Arvis is only Rishos. Also, I'll tell you an afkamina. This is a Pri Megadim Kuf Chavav. Let's assume a person doesn't daven mincha on Erev Shabbos, and he realizes his mistake, and he davens Tashlumei Mincha. Oh, and he has the following idea. You know what? I'll daven Mariv, and I'll beyotze my chiv of Tashlumei Mincha with the bracha Chesmin Sheva. Bracha Chesmin Sheva. Would that work? You know what I will tell you? Wow, that's the machlokas, the Brehetiv and Kuvches against the Rashash. If you assume that Tashlumei Mincha is a Rishus, because Tashlumei Mincha at night cannot be more chomer than Mariv, then you could be Yotzei. But if you assume is that Brehetiv and Kuvches, that would not be the case. And in such an instance, you could not be Yotzei the chiv Tashlumei Mincha, the bracha Chas, Mein Sheva. That I think is an important possibility. A possibility. You know, I mentioned the chiyuvim of Shachris, Mincha, Mariv. Okay. If I were to ask you, what is the basis of Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv? That's the Brachos and Chavav. You'll tell me very simply. Keneged Tmidim Tiknu, or based on Avos. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Avram was Masakin Tefillah Shachris, Yitzchak that of Mincha, Yaakov of Mariv. Okay. But I'll tell you the following kasha. Mincha really is the Tefillah of Yitzchak. Is that so obvious? Yeah, that's what the Gemara says in Brachas Chavav. But, no. Yima Chavches. You know what the Gemara calls Tefillas Mincha? Silusa de Avram. The Tefillah of Avram Avinu. And that's something which is stunning. You've all heard of that Gemara in Brachos Chavav, that Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv. Yeah, but the Gemara is mufurish that Mincha is the Tefillah of Avram Avinu. Okay. That's the kasha of the Tosas Yishanim. Yuma Chavches, take a look at that daf. Avram Avinu daven Mincha, and Yitzchak Avinu was Masakin Tefillas Mincha. Is that a stira? It's the Tosas Yishanim. That's not a stira at all. You know who the first was to daven Mincha? Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu was the first to daven Mincha. That's clear. Let me ask you the following. Who expanded and institutionalized the tefillah of Avram Avinu? Avram Avinu daven Mincha, that certainly is true. But you know what Yitzchak did? Yitzchak expanded the avodas Hashem of Avram Avinu. He took the private practice of his father Avram Avinu and made that into a takan l'daros. Avram Avinu was masakin tefillah shachris, but tefillas mincha no. Avram Avinu daven mincha, but he wasn't masakin tefillas mincha. Wow, that's a Tosas Yishanim. Yitzchak expanded the mission of Avram Avinu. Ooh. Is anyone here who was here 7 years ago? Just anyone else? You were here 7 years ago also? You want to say the Dvar Torah? I can, yeah? Okay. Ooh. So 7 years ago, I began as follows. The parsha begins, Eila toldos Yitzchak ben Avram holi es Yitzchak. Rashi is bothered by the double lashon. No? Of course. Why are both necessary? So I raised the following question that, you know what? Eila toldos. Take a look at the Tosos Hashalim, the very beginning of Parshas Toldos. There the Balei Tosos writes the following, that, you know, Yitzchak was a tolda of Avram Avinu. Kol ma she'er l'Avram Eila Yitzchak. Whatever happened to Avram Avinu replayed itself in Yitzchak. Take the Balei Tosos write 14 parallels between the life, the legacy of Avram Avinu, and that of Yitzchak. And I raised a very, very simple question, because 7 years ago, as now, you were learning Bava Kama. And guess what? Beis Amud Aleph, the Gemara introduces two different models of Toldos. There are Toldos of Shabbos, and there are Toldos of Tumah. And that represents a very, very different Hagdara, If I were to ask you, what exactly is the relationship between an Av and a Tolda when it comes to Shabbos? And if I were to ask you, what's the source of Toldos on Shabbos? You know what you're going to tell me? Well, clear, no, Shabbos Tafayin, Gzeres HaKosav, Gzeres HaKosav. Hopefully you saw the Shittu Gebetzes, Bavakam Daf Beis Lamed Aleph. Why does Shabbos require Gzeres HaKosav, Achas Mehena, Shabbos Tafayin? And here, when it comes to Nezikin, Midik Taniyavos, Michlal Dika Toldos, there's no Gzeres HaKosav whatsoever. Why is Toldos a svara when it comes to Nezikin, and Gzeres HaKosav when it comes to Shabbos? That's a very, very heavy issue. Is there a halacha of Toldos b'chol Torah kula? Toldos b'chol Torah kula. Right, not for tonight's shir, but take a look at Shar HaMelech in Hilchos Rotzeach. Take a look at the Tosos b'choros Daf Chafei. Are there Toldos when it comes to Shari Surim? Toldos when it comes to Shari Surim. Wow, that's very important. You know, if I know something is a Tolda, for example, of Zoreya, how relevant is that to Shari Surim? Let's say you have a Nachal Esa. You know what the pasuk says? Lo Yizareya. You can't plant a Nachal Esa. Oh, can I argue that all the Toldos are also forbidden? Because what is true on Shabbos is true of Nachal Esa. Wow. I know on Shabbos the Tolesh is Chayiv Mishum Gozes. So if the Torah tells me I can't be Gozes, a Bechor, what about the Toldos of Gozes? That's Toldos and Bechoros and Daf Chafei. That's a fascinating deal. The relationship of Avos and Toldos, B'chol Torah Kula. But if I were to ask you, what exactly is the status of Avos and Toldos when it comes to Shabbos? You know, I think you would tell me the following. You know, let's assume, for example, the Malacha of Zareya, placing a seed in the ground, that's the Av Malacha. You're only chayiv if you place the seed in the ground. What happens if you weed, menachesh? What happens if you water, mashgamayim lizraim? You know what? Of course, you're chayiv midaraisa. You're killed for that because that's considered to be a tolda. Like cutting of bays, possibly a tolda of Zareya. How do you jump from placing a seed in the ground to watering? You know what the answer is? The malach of Zoreya is not just the act of placing a seed in the ground, but you know, anything that you do to promote its growth is Zoreya. Zoreya is not only a maisa zriya of placing the seed in the ground, but anything that promotes the growth of, that is considered to be a tolda of Zoreya. That's pretty fascinating. So if I were to ask you conceptually, what exactly is a tolda when it comes to cases of Shabbos? You know what I would tell you? A tolda is an expansion of the Av. The Av Malach is placing the seed in the ground. That's true. You know what? But I'm going to expand the Hagdara. It is not only placing the seed in the ground, but anything that promotes its growth in any shape or form, pruning, watering, weeding, all of that is going to be considered to be that which is a tolda. So therefore, that's a tolda of Zareya, because we're going to view Zareya as the promotion of the growth of not only the act of planting the seed itself. And wow, now you're going to have to work on it, as I'm sure you did, all the nafkaminas of Avos and Toldos, with the Gemara here, the Sugin Shabbos and Daf Tzadivav, the Ran Schidish, that now, Lachashin Tzrich Lagufa, many differences. But the Hagdara of a Tolda, when it comes to Shabbos, is a Tolda of expansion. When it comes to the case of Tuma, is the same true? A mace is an Aviyavos HaTuma. Someone comes in contact with the mace, you know what? He's an Avatuma. The chain can continue in a Rishon Latuma. What exactly is the Hagdara of a tolda of Tuma? It's an expansion. We don't only define a mace as a mace, a nifter, a cadaver. No, a mace is even a person who came in contact with. That's an expansion. Chefzer Shomeis applies to the tolda. No, certainly not. It's not the dino kames. You know what I'm going to tell you? When a person comes in contact with an aviyavos satuma, when a person is the same oil as aviyavos satuma, you know what happens? There is a residual effect. Something wears off. You know, there is an element of tuma now that all of a sudden applies to be, even though it is not dino ka'eh. That's the notion of avos and toldos when it comes to tuma. It is not considered to be an expansion of, but someone will ask me, why are you tameh? Why do you have a tumas mace? You know what the answer is? I came in contact with a mace, and there's a residual effect. The tuma that this person has emanates from the tuma of the Aviavos Satuma. So you know what I would tell you? I would tell you that the notion of Toldos when it comes to Shabbos is very different to Toldos when it comes to Tuma. Toldos when it comes to Shabbos is an expansion, an expansion. And Toldos when it comes to Tuma is emanation. The status that you have of a degree of Tuma, where did that come from? It emanates and emanates from. I will tell you those are two very different Hagdaros of Toldos. One is expansion and one is emanation. I'll ask you the following: Toldosen kayotze b'hem or lav kayotze b'hem? You know what I would suggest? Well, when you're dealing with the tolda of expansion, well, Toldosen kayotze b'hem. If the definition of zareya is not just merely placing a seed in the ground, but rather whatever promotes its growth, what is true of A is true of B. But if you have a tolda which is not expansion, but rather it's emanation, doesn't it make sense to assume that there's a step down? There's a step. It's true. The residual tuma that you have emanated from the niftar. But it's not that you dino kamei, certainly not. And therefore, it doesn't surprise me at all that in Shabbos toldosen kayotze b'hem. When it comes to tuma, toldosen lav kayotze b'hem. Lav kayotze b'hem. And what would you say then when it comes to cases of nizikin? So I'll tell you, the lumdus then would be as follows. Well, look. If the Told is an expansion of the Hagdara of the Av, I would say Toldosen kayotze b'hem. And if you were to argue that's not true, that the Told emanates from the Av, I would tell you then like Tuma Toldosen lav kayotze b'hem. So typically Nezikin, isn't that a Told of expansion? You know, you have a case of a Shor Shenagach. Oh, in such a case, Negicha. Oh, that's considered to be the Av. I understand, as Rashi says, that which is the Kra behedya. I got that, no? But there's a tolda, and that's that Shita Mekubet says, even without a Gzeres Akasu. Isn't it self-evident that you're not only Chaya for sure, Bor and Mav and Hever? This represents Hagdaros. That's the Chiddush of Marikatz, that you don't require a Gzeres Akasu. When it comes to the Toldos of Nezikin, even though in Shabbos, of course you do, because Shabbos is based on Dumida Mishkan. And if it was not found in Mishkan, how can you have any basis of Chiyuv whatsoever? But Nezikin, obviously, that's an expansion. That's an expansion. So Karen does not just simply mean a Shor Shenagach. You know what Karen means? You have to learn the sugyas, either Kavanas Lazik or not necessarily, maybe just Mishuna. Mishuna. When the animal acts out of character, in such a case, whether or not Kavanas Lahazik. Wow. So in such a case, that's a Hagdara. That's a Hagdara. If that's true, if it's an expansion of Kiyigach, then of course, that Toldosen are Kayotze b'hem. Oh, our Gemara tells us there's an exception. What happens when it comes to tzoros? Oh, that's the case that Toldosen lav Kayotze b'hem. Why exactly is that true? How would you be magdir? I will tell you the following. When an animal causes hezek begufo, that's tav malacha. Tzoros is an example where the hezek is called al yedei kocha. Al yedei kocha. What's the relationship of kocha and gufo? Kocha and gufo. You know what I will tell you? Kocha is not an expansion of gufo. Where did this kocha come from? Where did it emanate from? The regel, gufo. That is a told of tumintara. That's a told of emanation, not a told of expansion. And that's why we assume those cases, toldosein alav kayotze b'hem. Those are the two hagdaras. That's a chiddush and achlas dava, but I think it fits magnificently in the Gemara. But I think for us, there are two different hagdaras, two different hagdalos. You can have a tolda of emanation, a tolda of an expansion. I'll ask you the following question. Yitzchak was a tolda of Avram Avinu. No? In what sense? In what sense? Well, you'll tell me, well, obviously, Avram Holias Yitzchak. Where did Yitzchak come from? You know what the answer is? He was fathered by Avram Avinu. He emanated from Avram Avinu. That certainly is true. That certainly is true. But I'm going to tell you much more than that. Much more than that. You know why Yitzchak is a tolda? Yitzchak is a tolda not merely in the realm of Tuma and Tara that he emanated from Avram Avinu, but the legacy, the mission of Yitzchak was an expansion of the life and legacy of Avram Avinu. And therefore, if that really is true, of course he was considered to be a tolda of Avram. A tolda of Avram in a twofold sense. Oh, so that's what the Torah tells us, that Mikar Hadin, Yitzchak was a tolda because, that's the Baliatosis, everything that Avram Avinu experienced, Yitzchak embraced, he institutionalized. Avram Avinu davens mincha, and Yitzchak is Mesakin Tfilas Mincha. That's Eila Toldos, Avram Yitzchak. And of course, in addition to that, Avram Holiness Yitzchak. He was a Tolda in the dual sense, He emanated from Avram Avinu, but an expansion of. Now I'll tell you an incredible Ramban. Take a look in Toldos, Chaf of Gimel. The Ramban writes the following. Time and time again in Chumash, the Torah tells us, Asher Nishbati, Lavram, Yitzchak and Yaakov. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, I made a shvuah. To Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The Ramban writes something incredible. Where was there a shvuah to Yitzchak? The Ramban challenges, go through Chumash and show me a shvuah to Yitzchak. Guess what? There was no overt shvuah to Yitzchak. The Ramban, no, Chafav Gimel. There was a shvuah to Avram Avinu, there was a shvuah to Yaakov. There wasn't a shvuah to Yitzchak. How can the Torah say time and time again, Asher nishbati, la'Avram avicha? I understand that, but to Yitzchak, how could that be? You know what the answer the Ramban writes? Chafav Gimel. Ba'kimosi es hashvua, Asher nishbati la'Avram avicha. The shvuah to Yitzchak was not an independent shvuah. The shvuah to Yitzchak is through you, I will carry out the shvuah that I made to your father. That's pretty incredible. The shvuah of Yitzchak was not an independent shvuah, but Asher nishbati la'Avram avicha means that you are going to be the expansion, the fulfillment of that which I promised to Avram Avinu. That was the legacy of Yitzchak. I'll tell you the following. There is a Tosas in Yavamas Chaf Beis and Beis, where Tosas writes that, there are two differences midaraisa between the term Zera and Ben. Zera and Ben. Children are referred to as Ben or Banim and Zera. What exactly is the difference? What exactly is Tosas technical kasha, Sugya Kedushin Daf Dalid, when it comes to a Bas Kohen who marries a Yisrael? You know what? Let's say the husband dies. There are times that she can go ahead and once again eat Truma as long as Zera Einla. That's the pasuk, Zera Einla. Tosas is bothered. Yavamas Chaf Beis. When it comes to Yibam, Rachmana litzlan, a person dies without any children, there the pasuk says, Uben Einla. Tosas. What's the difference between Zera as opposed to Ben? What's the difference between Zera as opposed to Ben? So Tosas writes, two nafkaminas midarais. Tosas writes, number one, you know what Zera means? Something which is enduring, something which is everlasting. Zera is one generation after another. That's Zera. Ben is a single generation. You cannot call a grandchild a Ben, but you can call a grandchild Zera. Tosas. And Tosas then writes in Afkamin in the other direction. Zera is only Zera kosher. Zera is not Zera pasul. A ben can be kosher, a ben can be pasul. Wow. So Tosas writes, that's important to remember. No two nafkaminas daraisa between the term Zera as opposed to the term of Ben. And how incredibly meduyak. Yitzchak, ki v'Yitzchak yikar l'chazar. Yitzchak is the Zera Avram. Typically, Yishmael is referred to as Yishmael Beno. Yishmael is the Ben Avram, and Yitzchak is the Zera Avram. Zera means Zera kosher, and Zera means something which is enduring, something which is everlasting. That's the Gemara Sanhedrin Daf Nun Tes, where the Gemara says Bris Milah was given Lazarach Hacharecha, to the Zera Avram. You know what that means? Avram Yitzchak. And the Bnei Yishmael are not chayiv in Bris Milah, Eretz Yisrael. Lazarach Hanasate Yasaretz Azos. Eretz Yisrael is given to the Zera Avram. You know what that means? Avram Yitzchak. Yishmael has no claim to Eretz Yisrael at all. Lazarach Hanasate Yasaretz Azos. So that very Gemara, Sanhedrin Daf Nun Tes says, okay, Avram Yitzchak. What about beyond Yitzchak? So the Gemara says something which is stunning. Avram Avinu had two sons, one which was Zera, one which was Ben, Yitzchak and Yishmael. And the Gemara says the same was true of Yitzchak. Yitzchak is going to have two sons. One is going to be Zera and one is going to be Ben. One is going to be the one who receives the Yerusha, the Marasha, Torah, Eretz Yisrael, Bris Milah, and the other is considered to be a ben, a ben. Wow, wow. That's an incredible parallel. What happened to Avram Avinu happened to Yitzhak as an expansion of, no doubt. But when it comes to Yitzhak, it's clear. The pasuk says, "Ki Yitzhak yikar chazara." That means Yitzhak and not Yishmael. Understand? What about the next generation? Where do you see that that's true? So you know what the Gemara says, "Bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak, Bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak." The same thing is going to happen. Yitzchak, two children, one in, one out, one zera, and one a ben. Bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak. You know what's unclear though? Oh, Reb Chaim, no. You know what's unclear? That Yitzchak, I understand. The Torah says, "Ki Yitzchak yikar chazara." What about the next step? The next step just says one in, one out. Bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak. How do you know? Person's going to push the argument. How do you know that Yaakov yes and Esav no? How do you know? I understand one yes, one no. Imagine a person will come forward and claim that Esav yes and Yaakov no. Rahman al-Islam. How do you know that it was Yaakov and it wasn't Esav? You know who answers this question? The Rambam. Very beautiful Chos Malachim. But take a look. Incredible, incredible. You know what the Rambam writes? It's true. The pasuk doesn't say explicitly. It doesn't say explicitly, Yaakov yes and Esav no. But you know what? That is going to become clear regarding the bracha. Whoever is going to receive the bracha, Parshas Toldos, they are the Zera Avram. They are the Zera Avram. So whereas the pasuk says explicitly, Yitzhak as opposed to Yishmael, the next generation is going to be determined by the bracha. And Yaakov received the bracha, and therefore he is considered to be the Zera Avram. And you know what? You take a step back from that frightening comment, and whoa, Yitzchak was willing to give the bracha to Esau. If not for incredible intervention, you'll tell me it's a bracha. I understand it's a bracha. You're telling me the bracha is going to determine who is the Zera Avram, the next generation. That's going to determine whether it's Yaakov Viner or whether it's Esav Harasha. That's going to be determined by the bracha. And Yitzhak was fine and good in giving the bracha to Esav, if not for the incredible intervention. How could that possibly be? How could that be? A bracha, okay, maybe one could understand, everyone is deserving of a bracha to an extent, but the bracha is going to determine Zera Avram, Eretz Yisrael, Bris Milah, Torah, Morasha, Yerusha, all of which, Esav yes and Yaakov no. It's inconceivable. How can that possibly be? That, I think, requires a significant teretz. And perhaps the teretz is exactly this point, but the Beis Halevi highlights. Yitzchak thinks he's speaking to Esav, and incredibly, he's willing to give Esav a bracha. But you know what the answer is? What was the substance of this bracha? What bracha was this? It sounds so unusual. V'yitin l'chelokim mital ha'shamayim mishmani haaretz. Tal ha'shamayim mishmani haaretz. That was not the bracha that Yitzchak received from his father, Avraham Avinu. When we talk about that bracha of Tal ha'shamayim mishmani haaretz, you know what that bracha is? That bracha is things, materialism. That's what we call gashmias. Now, why is Yitzchak giving this bracha? That was not the bracha that he received from his father, Avraham Avinu. Isn't that clear? You know what the answer is? Very, very simply. Yitzchak's mindset, he was addressing Esav. And you know what? There are two different brachas. There's the bracha of the Birchas Avram, which is Armorasha, and there's the bracha of Mishmani Haaretz. Yitzchak feels, you know what? I have two sons. One is the Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. The other is the Ish Yodei Etzayid. Why can't Esav at least receive a bracha of Tal Hashamayim Mishmani Haaretz, a bracha of materialism, a bracha of Gashmias? What's wrong with Esav receiving that bracha? I'll tell you why, from Yitzchak's perspective, that makes so much sense. Because there was something unusual about Yitzchak. Look, everything that happens to Avraham Avinu happens to Yitzchak. Avraham Avinu experienced Arav, the Bali Atosu, so he went to Mitzrayim. All of a sudden, Yitzhak experienced, and all of a sudden, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, you dare not leave Eretz Yisrael. Oh, Rashi, you're in Ola Tamima. You're in Ola Tamima. What does that mean, you're in Ola Tamima? An incredible medrash? No. The Torah tells us, when it comes to Akedas Yitzhak, Avram Avinu is about to offer Yitzhak, and all of a sudden, there's an ayil. Well, and the Torah tells us, Vayaleu le'olah tachas beno. Tachas is a key word. Tachas is a key word. A person, let's say, is makdish a karbanola, and he decides to offer something else, and he says, Zeh tachazeh, zeh tachazeh. Obviously, you know what the halach is, no? Husmrosi yakodesh. B now has a kedusha, but A retains its kedusha. A retains its kedusha. It's not zeh tachazeh, that B instead of A. It means B in addition to A. You know what that means? Mufurish and Medrash. Now that Yitzhak had the status of a karbanola. A karbanola has a psul yotzei. Now, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, don't you dare leave Eretz Yisrael. You know, for a person that has that status, a kedushas hakarban, a karban ola, there's certain karbanos where, you know what, you offer this on the mizbeach, but you partake. A karban ola is kulo kolol, it's kul Hashem. From Yitzhak's perspective, the Nitziv writes, you know what Yitzhak was? Doma lamalach Hashem tzvakas. Yitzhak was otherworldly, otherworldly. If you were to see Yitzhak, literally, Nitziv, you would fall off of your horse. Exactly what Rivka did when she perceived Yitzhak. And then Nitziv writes, realized the relationship of Yitzhak and Rivka was in that image, that Yitzhak was an Ola Tamima. She was overawed by who Yitzhak indeed was. You know, you have a conversation with Yitzhak about the house and about the car and about the summer home. You know what Yitzhak would tell you? I don't speak that language. No, my language is all of Ruchnius. My language is a karbanola. So therefore, I would say it's very natural that there's the bracha of Tal HaShamayim Mishmar Aretz. That's the domain of Esau. What does that have to do with the Birchas Avraham? That was the Havamina of Yitzchak. Very reasonable. Let Esav have that. Yaakov, Ishtam, Yoshev Ohalim. So when Yitzchak thought he was giving a bracha to Esav, that was the bracha, Tal HaShamayim Mishmar Aretz. Where do you find the conveyance of the Birchas Avram? The bracha that Yitzchak received from Avram being passed down to the next generation? That's at the end of the parsha. When Yitzchak absolutely knew he was speaking to Yaakov Avinu. That wasn't up for grabs. It was obvious that Yaakov Avinu was going to receive the Birchas Avram. And you take a look at that Rambam. The Rambam writes that B'Yisuk v'lo Kol Yisuk is not clear. You know what? That's going to be determined by the bracha. Which bracha? Ram's Mefurish. V'yitinachas Birchas Avram. The Rambam's Mefurish. The Rambam does not write the bracha of Tal HaShamayim Mishmar Aretz. The Rambam writes the bracha of the Birchas Avram. Why was there such incredible intervention? That also is stunning. Because apparently, even if that was true for Yitzchak, that was not true for Yaakov Avinu. The life of Yaakov Avinu was not the Karban Ola. The life of Yaakov Avinu was a life of Golus, a life of hardship, a Sulam Utzavarsa, Rosh Magia Shemaima, a life of a Shiluv, a confluence, a synthesis of Tal HaShamayim Mishmar Aretz. And therefore, Hashkachas Hashem was clear. Whoever receives the bracha of the Birchas Avram also has to receive the bracha of Tal HaShamayim Mishmar Aretz. That those two brachos are inseparable. Your mission is to be Mekadesh, what otherwise would be Chol. And therefore, as the Zerah of Yaakov Avinu, that becomes now the mission. The mission is not just an Ola Tamima, but rather the mission is one of converting that which otherwise could be mundane into that which represents a sense of absolute Kedusha and Tara. I'll tell you an incredible marmakum. This is a Rambam, but take a look, Pirush Mishnayos, and the Darm Daf Lamed Aleph. But take a look at that Pirush Mishnayos. Something which is stunning. The Mishnah says something just very technical. A person makes a neder, she'eni nehene lezera Avram. He's not allowed to derive benefit from a Jew, but he can derive benefit from a non-Jew, because zera Avram is only Bnei Yaakov. Clear. Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Tes. Clear, clear. The Rambam writes, how do you know that? How do you know that? The Rambam could have mentioned my whole shir, no, and that is the brachos, no, that the Rambam writes in Perkei Hilchos Malachim. The Rambam writes something else. And this is incredible. This is incredible. The Rambam writes the following. Avram Avinu was told, part of the bris ben abasarim, ki ger yezaracha beretz lo lahem, v'avadu v'ino sarba meyoshana. Your zera is going to wander from place to place to place, and they are going to suffer for hundreds of years. Ki ger yezaracha beretz lo lahem, v'avadu v'ino sarba meyoshana. You know what the Rambam writes? But incredible. Who experienced that? Who experienced that? Bnei Yishmael, Bnei Esav. They experienced wandering from place to place to place. They experienced Shibud Mitzrayim. The fact that we wandered from place to place to place, before Rambam, the fact that we experienced Shibud Mitzrayim is the Rayim Uchachas, that we're the Zera Avram. How do you know Eretz Yisrael is ours? Because we wandered from place to place. How do you know Eretz Yisrael is ours? Because we experienced Shibud Mitzrayim. And I'll tell you that it places an entirely different perspective. You know, when you look in the end of that Shabbos' Kriyas HaTorah, you look at the end of Parshas Vayishlach as well, the Torah spends so much time describing every settlement, every encampment, every city that Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav settled. You know, sometimes you ask yourself, why is that so important? Why is that so relevant? If I were to ask you to list those cities, you probably wouldn't get any of them right, no? Because you kind of just read through it so quickly, no? But realize how important that is, no? Every city that they established, every area that they conquered, every area that they're able to settle is a rayim uchachas that they are not the Zera Avram. The Zera Avram, ki ger yirzacha beretz lo lahem, v'avod v'ino sarba meyoshana, is the Rambam writes. Who experienced that? Who experienced that? We are the Zera Avram. And the Zera Avram means thick and thin, thick and thin. In good times and in times of pain and anguish. You know what? We embrace that. We are the Zera Avram, the Zera Avram. The life of Yitzchak was life in Eretz Yisrael. The life of Yaakov was a life of Golus, a life of Golus. And I'll tell you an amazingly reciprocal relationship. Yaakov Avinu's life was one in the choshech of Golus, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to Yaakov Avinu b'maros halayla, b'maros halayla, the Meshech Chochmah. That was unique when it comes to Yaakov, that in the choshech of Golus you can experience Nevuah. You can experience Nevuah. Of course, you can experience Nevuah in the clarity of day, but in the choshech of Golus you can experience Nevuah. That was the legacy of Yaakov Avinu, b'maros halayla. And you know what Yaakov Avinu did? Something absolutely incredible. Kadosh Baruch Hu revealed himself to Yaakov Avinu at night, wow. And Yaakov Avinu was Mesakin Tfilas Arvis. That's pretty heavy, no? That's pretty heavy. Kadosh Baruch Hu reaches out to Yaakov Avinu at night, in the Choshech of Galus, and Yaakov Avinu is Mesakin Tfilas Arvis. Tfilas Arvis. We can reach out to Kadosh Baruch Hu in the Choshech of Galus as well. That was a different mission than that of Yitzchak, because Yaakov Avinu was the recipient of both brachos, A bracha of Ruchnius, that certainly is true. But you know, a bracha of how it is we serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world of Talash Shema Mishmani Haaretz, in this world, yes, where we live in significant times of Galos. But you know what the answer is Galos for up is an opportunity to be Matzmiach Yeshua. Kadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself to Yaakov Avinu, b'maros halayla, and Yaakov is Mesakin, Tfivas Arvis. That's something I'll tell you which is stunning. You know, you'll ask me, I'll just conclude that Shachar, Mincha, and Mariv, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that's Brachos Chavav. Brachos Chav Zayin is Machlokes, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, whether Tfilas Arvis is Rishus or Tfilas Arvis is a Chova. No? Why would you say that Tfilas Arvis is a Rishus? Why is Mariv different than Shachris and Mincha? Why would you say there's any difference at all? See, not so clear. There is a Rashi Fascinating. This Rashi is not a Maseches Brachos. You have to learn Maseches Shabbos Daftes. And Rashi writes, you know why Tfilas Arvis is Rishus? Because Tfilah is based on Karbanos. And there's a marked difference between a carbon tamid shel shachar, carbon tamid shel ben arbayim, and at night, that there's no carbon kavua, evarim upadarim. Okay. But I'll tell you something striking. The Shilto Ches, Tefillah Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, and Marav Izrushos. Wow. If it's connected Karbanos, I understand why Marav is different than Shachris Mincha. But if it's based on Avos, why would you discriminate against the Tefillah of Yaakov Avinu? Avram Avinu's Tefillah, Yitzchak's Tefillah, that's a Chova. And Yaakov Avinu's Tefillah is a Rishus. Why would that be? So I'll tell you that I think is the answer. There's something remarkable about the Tefillah of Yaakov. You know what? That taught us, Maros Halayla. Even in times of Golus, even in times of Choshech, one can experience Hashras Hashkin Hashkochas Hashem. And in reciprocal fashion, you know what? You can reach out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Choshech of Golus. That's something which is remarkable. That even in Golus, we have that relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shchinta Bagalusa, Imo Anochi Betzara. That's something that is incredible. You know, when a person is down and out and his back is against the wall, that's when a person can really tell who his best friends are. Not those who accompany him in the times that are good, but those who are there thick and thin. You know, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us in times of Golus, Shrinta Bagalusa, Maglin Rabu Imo, Malkus Tafyud, that's the greatest indicator, you know, of the Av that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for Knesset Yisrael. Is that remarkable? Yes. Transformative? Incredibly so. Now, does that speak volumes in terms of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I would say absolutely yes. I would tell you one thing that it's not. It's remarkable, it's transformative, it's impactful, but there's one thing that it is not. You know what it's not? This is not the destiny of Klal Yisrael. The destiny of Klal Yisrael is not to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Choshech of Laila. Our mission, our destiny, is to be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in times of Geula. If necessary, we'll serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Golus. That's absolutely clear. But you know, we're not Golus Jews. We're Jews, Shabbos Lamed Aleph, that are Mitzapah Yeshua. Oh, and that I would tell you, if that really is the case, as remarkable and as transformative, as impactful as Tfilas Arvis is, it always was, and always is, and always will remain a Tfilas Rishus. The Tfilah Kavua is the Tfilah not in the Choshech of Laila. The Tfilah Kavua is in the Hashras HaShchina, like Be'emtza Hayom. That's what we're mispalel for. Oh, and that's even the Chiddush of Reb Chaim. Know that Shavila Kechov that I mentioned before does not mean that Tfilas Arvis is a Tfilas Chova. You know what Shavila Kechova means? A Chovas Hagavra to daven a Tfilas Nadava every Laila. No? Wow, we'll do so. Farnogo Kol Yisrael. But Bechefs, it doesn't become a Tfilas Chova. That's something which is part of our consciousness. That has to be our mindset. Service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Galus, absolutely. Remarkable. Shchinta B'Galusa. But don't be complacent. Don't be satisfied with our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Galus. You have to be Mitzapah Yeshua. And it's not so easy to Mitzapah Yeshua because we live in a Galus of Chesed. It may be very well that, you know, the past couple of years, all of a sudden, you know, that we're not as secure as we thought we once were. Whether in Eretz Yisrael or certainly in Chutz La'aretz, you know, time and time again. Now the cycle of news, it's pretty incredible that, you know, people in Chutz La'aretz don't have that same security that they had a year ago and a half a year ago. You know, we shouldn't. This is Golus. This is not our place. Can we serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Choshech HaGolos? Absolutely. But that is not a tefillah kavua. That is not a tefillah schova. That is a tefillah rishus. And indeed, you have to be mitzapeh liyeshua. And what do you do? What do you do in Golus? You know what the answer is? You position yourself. You position yourself as best as you can. You know that Knesset Yisrael has an incredible team. No, the Chayalim, the Mispalim, Parshas Matos, Elif Lamata, an incredible confluence, an incredible confluence. And for those who are the Lomdei Torah, you have to do so with Hasmadatzum. You have to see to it that you learn literally, Yomam Valayla. You know, why is there a need for like a couple hour break in the middle of the afternoon? You know, why exactly is that? Is that true? Working people in America don't take a couple hour breaks in the middle of the afternoon. No, a chayal doesn't take a couple hour break when times are tough in the middle of the afternoon. Not like why? Why is that okay for us? Why is that okay for us? No, you need a little downtime. That's okay. I understand that. I understand that. But you know what? You have to crunch. You have to crunch those hours of learning, and see to it that it becomes absolutely part of you. And as I tell you time and time again, you have to chazer repeatedly. Chazer repeatedly. Kadosh Baruch Hu did not create us that, you know, you learn something once and all of a sudden you remember it photographically. You know, that's not who we are. That's who we are. You know what? It means that you chazer time and time and time and time again. Time and time again. That's what you have to do. That's part of your derech halimud. That you have to chazer. And you know what? With all that hishtadlus, you know, I'm going to crunch the hours. You know, I'm going to, you know, see what I can do to learn incredible hasmada. And I'm going to chazer incessantly. I understand that. But, you know, there's one more requirement. Needed afayin, tefillah. You have to mispalo HaKadosh Baruch. And the Gemara is explicit. Hablo halosagi. Without the koach hatfila, you're not going to be matzliach in learning, and you're not going to be matzliach in life. You know, sometimes Bnei Yeshiva think that, you know what, that okay, I'll learn, you know, okay, wonderful, but you know what? Davening, you know, okay, you know, sometimes on, sometimes off. It can't be that way. Can't be that way. You know, that davening is a necessary condition of Asek Batorah. Hablo halosagi. You have to be mishtadel, you have to learn, but you have to be mispalel. You have to be mispalel. Without the koach hatfila, you're not going to be matzliach in learning. And I would add, you're not going to be matzliach in any aspect of life. Kadosh Baruch Hu determines the outcome of everyone's hishtadlus. And part of the hishtadlus means that a person exerts appropriate effort. That's true. But a person has to daven to Kadosh Baruch Hu for siyata d'shmaya. And that's something that we have to focus on. Sometimes, unfortunately, we don't focus on enough, sufficiently, the koach hatfila, how tefillah absolutely transforms. So this is something that I think you have to try to harness. It's a lesson for all of us, right? The amelus batorah, the hasmada, chazara, and the koach hatfila. Because after all, we're the zera of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the zera kasha, which is enduring, that osus nivamas, daf chabeis. And that is our privilege, but that is an enormous responsibility. To be as loyal as we can to the legacy of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to implement that in everything that we do, to see to it that indeed we are mekadesh the chol, and therefore that we'll be the bearers of both of the brachas, the bracha of Birchas Avram and the bracha of Tal HaShamayim, Mishmar Haaretz. Kadosh Baruch Hu should give you that siyata d'shmaya, to matzliach in all aspects of learning, of avodas Hashem, to grow in avas haTorah, in Yerushalayim, to bring incredible nachas ruach to Kadosh Baruch Hu, and to be zoche to intense, amazing siyata d'shmaya.